Hello, Scallydandlers. So, you and me today, we're going to Iran in the company of Shokoofeh Azar and her rather wonderful book, The Enlightenment of the Greengage Tree. Now, I've got this one on Kindle, so I will attempt to show you the cover there. I know the picture's probably back to front, isn't it? And it's not ideal, but it gives you a little clue. So, Azar is an Iranian author. This is her first book, but she had a previous career in Iran as a journalist. You know, she's like a middle-aged woman, although this is her first novel. And yeah, she was a journalist, but having had 3 spells of imprisonment in Iran, she eventually fled the country and sought asylum in Australia in 2011 and lives there now. And that's where she published the book in 2017, sort of small Australian publisher, and then it was kind of taken up by Europa Editions and for the international market. And if you've heard of it, it'll be probably because it was on the shortlist for the 2020 International Booker Prize for Fiction. So it's kind of garnered more attention from that, although it didn't win. Now, and it's translated from the Persian or Farsi, but the translator has chosen to remain anonymous, and the book's banned in Iran. Now, not everyone has loved this book. I've done a little bit of looking at sort of reviews or other people's sort of responses to it, and it's mixed. I have to say I really did very much love this book and admired it, and I'm going to try and kind of explain why. I suppose I thought it was a fine book. I particularly wanted to record this video and get it up this weekend because on this is Sunday. On yesterday in the paper I read, which is The Guardian, it's UK paper, I read that Elena Ferranti, the Italian author, has published a list of 40 books by female authors from kind of like the 20th or beginning of the 21st century, that, yeah, her sort of her top 40, as it were, of women's writing from around the world. And it is genuinely a kind of usually when people do these lists, and actually they're really quite narrow, lovely broad list, including several books from Italy, from Italian women authors that I haven't read, which I'm looking forward to reading. But there we go. Number 3 on her list is probably alphabetical, isn't it? Yeah, I think. Was The Enlightenment of the Greengage Tree that I'm going to talk about today. I've read about half the books on her list, and I've read things by some of the other authors, and I may try and work through those 40 gradually. I mean, like the remaining ones I haven't read. Anyway. So, now normally when I do one of these Scallydandling videos, I'll do a little bit of context about sort of a little bit of history and geography of to sort of place a country, particularly if it's one where, if you're not from that neck of the woods, you might not be 100% sure about. Now, I think everybody on here will know Iran, and I'm going to quote another Iranian author here, the author Marjane Satrapi, who wrote the graphic novel Persepolis. It's an autobiographical book, and she talks about the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and then says, since then, this old and great civilization has been discussed mostly in connection with fundamentalism, fanaticism, and terrorism. As an Iranian who's lived more than half of my life in Iran, I know that this image is far from the truth. And I think that Shokoofeh Azar would say the same, almost like that's part of the passion behind writing this book, is to talk about the Iranian Revolution and its impact on um, Iranian culture, I suppose, and yeah, to try and she wants us to kind of appreciate that there's so much more to Iran than that. So, little quick locating of Iran in our mind. Well, obviously, used to be called Persia. It's a big country with a big population. It has the most extraordinary history, I suppose. And if I say it's a big country now, at its the biggest extent of the Persian Empire in antiquity, at the time of sort of Cyrus the Great and Darius and Xerxes, it went from Eastern Europe, Turkey, Egypt, all the way across the Middle East, Central Asia, top sort of northern bit of India. So it, that was sort of the peak, I suppose, of Persian power. That was in the 6th century BCE. But it's it's always had, I suppose, a kind of almost disproportionate sort of cultural and historical significance in different ways over time. And part of that, I think, is because of where it is. So it's at a real crossroads of peoples, I suppose. I'm not explaining that well. So the neighbour of Iran that we probably springs to most people's mind first these days would be Iraq, because of the Iran-Iraq war, and Iraq's kind of to the west. Um, Above Iraq is Turkey. Um, the southern boundary is the Persian Gulf. So on the other side of the Persian Gulf, you've got Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Then if you kind of go round to the eastern border, you've got Pakistan and Afghanistan. Then to the north, Turkmenistan, that's sort of like the beginning of Central Asia, as it were. And then Caspian Sea and the mountainous area of the Caucasus, so Azerbaijan and Armenia. So you can see it's of huge geopolitical kind of significance and kind of a cultural crossing point, I suppose. Yeah, and then you throw oil into the mix, and then you throw religion into the mix, and you can see why. Yeah. Well, now while we're talking about religion, another thing that you kind of need to know about Iran to fully enjoy this novel is that it has its own unique religion, Zoroastrianism, which is one of the oldest sort of continually participated in religions in the world, if that makes sense. Like sort of not as old as Hinduism, say, but much longer history than Christianity or Islam or Buddhism and so on. So we don't know exactly when Zoroaster lived, probably around the 10th century, but it's BC, but it's not clear. But yeah, and that was the main religion in Persia up until the Arab conquest in the 6th century AD or CE. And that is really important, I think, to Azar in the book. She harks back to Zoroastrianism. A key location in the book is a sort of ruined Zoroastrian fire temple. I think she kind of she sees parallels, I suppose, between the Arab conquest of Persia in the 7th century and the Iranian Revolution. I suppose she wants to feel, and I don't know whether this is sort of fair or right. I mean, you could probably argue with it, but I think it's almost like she wants to feel that the kind of fundamentalist Islamic regime in Iran now is almost unnatural for the country, even though it's been a Muslim country for an enormously long time now. But symbolically for her, I suppose she feels it doesn't it doesn't sum up perhaps Iran or Persia, as she would probably describe it. It's a sad and angry book, I think one has to say. And Azar's family obviously very much suffered in the Iranian Revolution, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini, you know all that, don't you? Yeah, and she obviously feels that kind of politicization of Islam was destructive of things that she perhaps would have valued about Iranian culture. She draws in the book, she really draws on kind of Persian classical literature. She really draws on Iranian folk tales and folk culture. We have like kind of jinns and mermaids and yeah. Before I read the book, I saw it described as magical realist, and I thought, oh, that's just people being a bit lazy, lazy reviewers, really lazy journalism describing it like that. But actually, that is a term that she embraces for the book, and magical realist writers come up in it from time to time. One of the funniest scenes in what is not altogether a funny book is when her parents' car is being searched by like the Revolutionary Guards or Morality Police or whatever, and they're looking to catch them out with something that they shouldn't have, and they find a copy of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and and they spend a long time kind of looking at this and reading bits of it to try and work out if it's subversive or acceptable, and in the end they decide that perhaps it's okay. So she nails that flag to her novel, and in fact I've read an interview with her where she actually describes it as that she draws on the ideas of magical realism, and magical realism's kind of gone a bit out of fashion, I suppose. People a bit scathing about it now, but I think it's really interesting, isn't it, that if you're trying to write about something that is so extreme and I don't know, kind of outrageous dictatorship or corruption, or in your country, it's one of the options to go down, isn't it? I mean, it's a good option to go down. The sort of allegory or magical realism. Because if you just literally described the awfulness of some of the things that she's talking about in this book, the sort of terror and oppression and executions and war, and if you described all that in a literal fashion, you either starts to seem, I don't know, exaggerated or unbelievable, or you can become a bit sort of almost deadened to it. Yeah, so I think I understand why she went down that road. But the other thing is that obviously, she really wanted to draw on what is a different and rich literary tradition, and it's a way to bring these things in. The narrator of the book is a teenage ghost, and I've read people who say that they don't like that voice, that they find it a bit, I don't know, petulant and teenage, or it doesn't sort of develop. But in a sense, that seems a funny thing to say. This is the ghost of someone who was burned alive. Yeah, petulant seems appropriate. I don't know. The voice worked fine for me. It's also clever because it allows you to do first-person narrative, but also an omniscient narrator, because she's a ghost. I mean, she's not totally omniscient, but she yeah, you know what I mean. it's a book you need to approach with an open mind. It's a very sort of non-linear. Um, there's one brilliant chapter that is like a kind of is more kind of allegorical rather than magical realist, I'd say, which is kind of like a version of the final days of Ayatollah Khomeini with mirrors and caves and well, yeah, yeah, I loved it. I loved it. I really enjoyed that. I sometimes what she does is the book. Another criticism of the book is a bit uneven, I suppose, and it is a first book, so you know we can forgive a little bit of that. But also, I think it's about the nature of the storytelling that she's drawing on. So she'll you'll tell a story in one chapter, and then the next bit will almost go back a phase and tell some of the last bit of that story in more detail from a slightly different perspective. It's sort of um, cumulative storytelling. Yeah, you can tell how much I like this book, can't you? It's also a book for lovers of books and reading because, as well as drawing on kind of Persian classical literature and folk tales and so on, she she's also, I suppose, um, is coming from a class of, of pre-revolutionary Iranian society that also was sort of steeped in the sort of the Western canon as well. And one of the most moving scenes in the book, and almost strangely more moving than some of the um, scenes where people die or suffer, is the scene where we see the family library being burnt, the books being burnt, and it's almost like they're people to her, um, and she talks about Austen and the Brontes, and but also, um, Persian authors, and yeah, you kind of uh, left wanting to do what Sean calls Google reading, going to look up all the books that she's referring to, or the authors she's referring to, and to the ones you don't know and find out more. Yeah, it's a really shocking scene. There are quite a few quite shocking scenes in the book, but it's not, I say, because of the sort of fantastic elements. It kind of balances that out. Um, Towards the end of the book, the father is imprisoned and interrogated, and he gives just briefly a kind of literal version of the story of the family. And you could think, oh, okay, so that's what really happened. But then Azar has actually specifically said that she doesn't want us to think of that as the real story. She wants the novel, the rest of the novel, to be what we think of as the real story. I'm interested in how she was thinking about all this. Yeah. One criticism that I've heard of the book, which is kind of true, but also I think maybe not fair, is that she's a bit uncritical of the Pahlavi Shah regime that preceded the revolution. Now, she comes from a kind of relatively, I suppose, aristocratic background that was sort of better off in those times, and she talks about the Shah's sort of like reforming stuff like literacy campaigns and so on, and doesn't talk about, I don't know, his secret police or whatever. Is it reasonable to complain about that? Yeah, no, I don't think so. She's a dissident voice in current Iran. Does she have to be balanced about why the Iranian Revolution happened? I'm not sure she does. I don't think that. I think that's an unreasonable demand, as it were. So, for me, this was a clever and beautiful and passionate and sad but enriching book to read, and I warmly recommend it. I would also recommend Persepolis, which was the book that I read you the introduction from at the beginning of this video. It's a graphic novel about growing up in Iran and then leaving and then coming back again. It's well worth a read. Came out in 2002, 2003, I think. Another book I would recommend as a lover of books, and a book about Iranian enthusiasm for literature, I suppose, is Reading Lolita in Tehran, which is a memoir by Azar Nafisi, who was an academic in Tehran University, I think, and then was no longer allowed to teach the full range of literature that she used to. So the book kind of it examines the revolution and so on, but it also it's all through the eyes of her kind of almost undercover book study group that she ran, and in Tehran, that was hence the title, Reading Lolita in Tehran. I really recommend it. It's well worth it. I think it came out in about 2000, and that's also around 2002, 2003. One final book by an Iranian woman author that I haven't yet read, but I'm very keen to, and I'm going to throw out there in case any of you have, because I'd be interested to hear your views of it, is Disoriental by Negar Djavadi. Now, it's another one that was on Elena Ferrante's. It's the other Iranian author in her list of 40 authors, the other book by an Iranian author, and it went, a little light bulb went ping when I saw that, because it's translated by Tina Kover, and I saw Sean, the book maniac, do one of his Zoom chats with that translator, Tina. She seemed like a lovely woman who talked about that book amongst others, and so definitely one that I want to read. And if you've read it, I would love to hear about it, or if you've read any other interesting Iranian novels or memoirs or poetry or graphic novels that you'd like to share, please do, and do consider reading The Enlightenment of the Greengage Tree.